we weren't quite enough.
Thank you, George, and thank you all for having me. My name is Joel Feinman. I am the Pima County Public Defender. I also have serve with the Pima County Democratic Party as second vice chair and first vice chair of Legislative District 3. But today I'm offering you lots of opinions. So when I give you my opinions, I am not giving you my opinions as your public defender or as an officer in the Pima County Democratic Party. Everything I'm about to say is my opinion as a private individual who has spent his adult professional life fighting against mass incarceration. Those two stories are pretty emblematic of what we do and why we do it. And I could spend a whole presentation talking to you about that one question. What I call the cocktail party question, which is people say, how can you defend guilty people? How can you defend people you know did something wrong? Not only is it easy, but it's actually a privilege, because what you realize when you start defending people, and as a public defender, the people you're defending are overwhelmingly poor, otherwise they wouldn't need me. They are disproportionately marginalized people and people of color. And what you start realizing is that they need defending more than anybody else. And they need allies more than anybody else. And they need someone to give voice to the voiceless more than anybody else. And it is certainly a privilege that I've spent my life doing that. So I'm here today to depress the ever-loving heck out of you. As you can tell by the title of my presentation, The Crimes of Mass Incarceration. As bad as you think it is, I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes telling you it is far, far, far worse. The good news is that I'm going to spend the last 5 minutes of my presentation, before I open it up to questions, telling you why I actually have tremendous hope for the future. I have hope because we have some incredible bills in front of the Arizona State Legislature. I have hope because we have some incredible elected officials fighting for those bills right now. And I have hope because we have some incredible candidates who I'm going to really try and help win in 2020 who care deeply about these issues. It's axiomatic that we imprison more people per capita and per number than any other country in the world. What people don't realize is that if Arizona was a country and we measured this per 100,000, the world incarceration rate, we're always in the top 10, usually in the top 5. That doesn't mean we have the 5th highest incarceration rate in the country. That means we have the 5th, 6th, 7th highest incarceration rate in the entire world. The country that is a distant number 2 to the United States is El Salvador. The country that is a distant number 3 to the United States' incarceration rate is Turkmenistan. We have more people in prison than any other society ever, period. Democracy, communism, tyranny, dictatorship. We cannot claim to be a free society if we have this many people in our prisons and our jails. Who we have in prison is incredibly disproportionate and incredibly disparate on the basis of race and gender. If you are a black man in this country, you have a 1 in 3 likelihood of spending time in prison. If you are a white man, it's 1 in 17. If you are a black woman, you have a 1 in 18% chance of winding up in prison. If you're a white woman, it's 1 in 111. By the way, all of these horrible, depressing statistics are going to be available to you at your leisure. I'm going to email them to George after this. Something to be very clear right off the bat, all the social science is unified. All ethnicities commit crime at the exact same rates when you control for poverty and when you control for disenfranchisement. The idea that some ethnicities are more criminogenic is complete and utter fiction. One thing that we don't hear about is what has happened since the war on crime began in the 1980s to the number of women in jails and prisons around the United States. And as you can see, the women's state prison population has actually grown faster than the men's state prison population. We don't hear about that very much, unfortunately. I can tell you, as somebody who's been a public defender now for about 13 years, I've had thousands of female clients. The vast majority of them have committed either a drug offense or a non-violent property offense to support their drug habit. And the reason they have done that is because I have yet to have one female client, and I think at this point I've defended at least 1,000. I have yet to have one female client who was not a victim of sexual abuse, emotional abuse, or physical abuse when she was younger. So when we incarcerate women for drug crimes, and when we incarcerate women for committing property crimes to support their drug habit, we are incarcerating rape victims, we are incarcerating physical assault victims, and we are incarcerating emotional assault victims. We are not incarcerating defendants, and I want to sort of emphasize this. There's a fiction that we draw in our minds and that our political system and our police and our prosecutors have foisted upon us, that we have defendants and we have victims. That is an utter fiction, especially when we look at women in prison and women in jails. They are victims too. They were victims when they were 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and that victimization is what caused them oftentimes to develop drug habits, and those drug habits caused the incarceration rate for women in this country to skyrocket since the war on crime started. We will have about 42,000 people going to bed in Arizona State Prison, 14,000 in local jails, 76,000 on probation. Altogether, we have 145,000 Arizonans who are trapped in some stage of the criminal justice system, in some form of confinement or some type of supervised probation or parole. These are the most current numbers available in Department of Corrections. We have to get away from this idea that the war on crime is the war on violent crime. We have to get away from this. And you don't have to believe me as the liberal public defender. You can believe the statistics put out by the Arizona Department of Corrections. Month after month after month, we see that drug offenses are the plurality of offenses that people are in prison for. If you put these numbers together, drug possession and drug trafficking, you get about 22%. 22% of all prisoners in Arizona prison tonight are there for drugs. 0.7% are there for identity theft, 0.9% are there for sex offenses, and 1.4% are there for sexual assault. We cannot allow police and prosecutors to tell us that they only prosecute and imprison violent criminals. That is simply not true. Half of the people in prison are there for nonviolent offenses. Half of the people are there for the first time. I can't even read this. What does it say? It's all blurry. 78% of inmates assessed at the time of intake have substance abuse problems. 1/4 of all people in Arizona prisons have severe mental illness. That's what our prisons are for. And don't let anybody tell you different. Our prisons and jails are not for keeping you safe from violent criminals. Our prisons and jails exist to warehouse the sick and the poor and the people who have drug problems. Again, these are not public defender statistics. These are statistics collected by the Arizona Department of Corrections. And if you really want to subject yourself to some depression, you can go onto their website, and they have this report month after month after month, and you can look at it month after month after month. It does not change. The highest percentage of cases prosecuted by the Pima County Attorney, by Barbara Lawal, are drug cases. Fiscal year 2018-2019, 34% of all felonies that she prosecuted were drug crimes. 6% were sex crimes. 34% are drug crimes. 6% are sex crimes. Do not be deceived that our criminal justice policies exist to protect us from violent criminals. That might be their original purpose. But the way they've been carried out for the last 5, 10, 20 years has been to prosecute the failed war on drugs in Pima County and in Arizona. 20% of everyone that we send to Pima County to prison, we send for drug possession. Not drug sales, not cartels, not trafficking, not the boogeyman that we want to talk to you about when we want to pass Stone Garden, not the fictitious Mexican cartel member that we're prosecuting. Drug possession. 20% of everyone from Pima County that we send to DOC, we send for drug possession. Where's sex offenses? 4%. Sometimes get people charged as drug dealers that we know, as attorneys, are drug users supporting their habit. And the problem is the person who decides whether to file charges for drug possession or drug sales is the prosecutor. And they can decide to do either, and there's no oversight. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to figure out, all right, you're saying that you only prosecute drug sellers. Well, number one, we know that that's BS, because I can tell you 20% of all people go to prison for drug possession. What are the amounts of drugs we're talking about? Pima County spends more than 50% of its budget on criminal justice. We spend $35,000 a year to keep one person in the Pima County jail. So how much drugs are involved here? Because if you want us to spend $35,000 to keep somebody in the Pima County jail for bringing across 20 pounds of methamphetamine, okay, maybe you have an argument. 70% of all our indicted felony drug cases, not drug possession, ladies and gentlemen, every single drug charge, trafficking, sales, possession, 70%, 2 grams or less. That's 2 sugar packets. 53%, less than 1 sugar packet. You are spending $35,000 a year to keep somebody in the Pima County jail because they had a sugar packet in their pocket. You are spending $27,000 a year to keep somebody in the Department of Corrections because they had a sugar packet in their pocket. Now, many of us have loved ones who've struggled with substance abuse. Some of us ourselves have struggled with substance abuse, and I'm not trying to minimize that. I'm not trying to say that this isn't a challenge. I'm not trying to say that we don't have an opioid crisis in this country. What I'm pointing out is that we have chosen the criminal justice system, the most expensive and the least effective method of dealing with those problems, to deal with those problems. Where's Pat? So, Pat sent me a letter and she wanted to talk about private prisons. Private prisons are horrific. They're worse than we think. They should be abolished. They are modern-day slavery, period. Private prisons are actually not the biggest problem. So in Arizona, you see about only 10, it's actually about 17% of all people in Arizona who are in prison are in private prisons. Actually, I'm sorry, I take it back. In 2017, it was 19%. So as terrible as private prisons are, and they are awful, even if we closed every private prison tomorrow, we would still have a human rights crisis on our hands. So again, when politicians and candidates come talk to you about how opposed they are to private prison and how their criminal justice priorities are closing private prisons, ask them, well, that's great. What about the other 80% of the problem? You just addressed 20% of the problem. What about the other 80% of the problem? As I said, private prisons are horrific. We see disparities in the rates of Black and Hispanic inmates is far higher within private prisons than public prisons. By the way, we have horrific racial disparities in public prisons. So the fact that it's even worse in private prisons just goes to show you that private prisons are as hellacious as you think they are. Again, I'm sorry, I try to tell people at the beginning, I don't think they get it. I have so much bad news for you. So strap in, maybe is it too early for a cocktail? I'm sorry, but I'll try and end on a high note. We see assaults on guards in private prisons are 49% more frequent than in public prisons, and assaults on fellow inmates are 65% more frequent, private prisons versus public prisons. This law took over in starting in 1970, when the war on crime started. We had about 103 people per 100,000 in the Pima County Jail. As of Friday, we had 278. That is a 169% increase. 169% more people in Pima County Jail now than we did when the war on crime began. We see, and I know this chart has a lot of information, but this shows you how racially disparate the population in the Pima County Jail is. The dotted line is jail population as a national average, and the solid line is Pima County. So what we see, for example, is we incarcerate Native Americans at a far higher rate locally than we do nationally. We incarcerate Hispanics at a higher rate locally than we do nationally. And shocker of all shockers, Caucasians, both locally and nationally, are incarcerated at the lowest rate of any ethnicity. And again, this is controlled for population. These aren't flat numbers. These are per 100,000. And again, every single social scientist worth their salt is in agreement. All ethnicities commit crime at the same rates. There is no ethnic difference when you control for population, education, and economic advantage. In 1996, when Ms. Lawal took over, there were 99 women in the Pima County Jail. On Friday, there were 255. That is a 157% increase. 157% increase in the number of women in Pima County Jail in the last 24 years. Those are not sexual assailants. Those are not murderers. Those are women who have substance abuse problems, who stole something to support their drug habit, and who did so because they were victims and are still victims oftentimes of horrific abuse. We are incarcerating female victims at a 150% higher rate than we did 24 years ago. Our jails and prisons exist to warehouse the mentally ill. 4.9% of women outside have severe mental illness. 31% of women in jail have severe mental illness. 3.2% of men, 14.5% of men. That's what we do in jail. As horrible as jails and prisons are for adults, they are Armageddon for children. In prison, 1 out of every 20 people is sexually assaulted. For juvenile inmates, it's 1 in every 8. What's important that I really want to try and get you all to understand, if we had a school system, if I told you Pima County school system is a great school system, 1 in 8 kids are sexually assaulted there. If I told you that we had a tax system, Arizona has a wonderful tax system, 1 in 8 children are destitute, you wouldn't accept that. There'd be a revolution. You would vote out every single politician overnight and say this is unacceptable in a civilized society.
We're trying.
But we're trying. And here's where I challenge you, Pam, maybe not Pam, but here's where I challenge the room. We're not trying hard enough because these are kids in jail. If these were kids out of jail, this would not even be an issue. But because they're kids in jail, and I'll challenge you even more, because they're poor kids, because they're brown kids, because they're mentally ill kids, because their parents have drug problems, well, it's not the priority it should be. That has to change. It has to change. We don't just traumatize the people that we put in jail and prison. We replicate that trauma throughout generations. Parental incarceration is associated with numerous adverse childhood experiences. Basically, when we put your parent in jail and prison, we are really doing a number on your child and grandchild's life. This whole fiction, this whole Republican fiction of you do the crime, you should serve the time, even if you buy into that, how does that justify how criminogenic trauma replicates across generations? Children with people and with adults, parents in prison are exponentially more likely to have substance abuse problems, face racial discrimination, face domestic abuse, have mental illness, or try to commit suicide. We are punishing children for the crimes of their parents. Employment, I'm sure it's no surprise to you. Trying to get a job after you get out of jail or prison, or even if you're never there, even if you're just on probation, and you're a felon now for the rest of your life, which, by the way, Arizona, being the civilized state it is, we don't give people a chance to expunge their records. In Arizona, when you're convicted of a felony, you're a felon for life. So if you know somebody who had a felony DUI in 1970 and has been a school teacher and a minister and a soup kitchen volunteer for the last 50 years, guess what? They're still a felon because they got a DUI in 1970. Education, 3 in 5 formerly incarcerated people were unable to afford to return to school, because how could they? They can't find a job. 2 in 3 families had difficulty meeting basic needs as a result of their loved one's conviction. This is another point that I really want to emphasize that goes along with the adverse childhood experiences. We don't just punish the adults. We punish the families and we punish the communities. We punish people who never did a crime in their lives when we put their loved ones in these horrific prisons and jails and dispossess them and disenfranchise them for the next 50 years. It's exponentially more difficult to find housing after you get out of jails and prisons. Your earning power is far lower. Estimated effective incarceration on male wages, weeks worked, and annual earnings, it's all lower post-incarceration versus if you're not incarcerated. And I know I'm going through this really quick. Like I said, you'll all have these slides if you want to look at the numbers more quickly. I just want to get to the happy part as soon as we can. This is something that I think you're all going to find extraordinarily interesting. Mass felony disenfranchisement equals mass voter suppression. Here we see the number of disenfranchised voters in the United States from 1960 up to 2016. In 2016, we had more than 6 million people in the United States disenfranchised because of a felony conviction. Like I said, in Arizona, like in most states, you're convicted of a felony, you lose your right to vote. In some states, in most states, Arizona including, you can get that vote back. But it's difficult, it's time-consuming, and oftentimes you have to afford a lawyer to help you do it. Total felony disenfranchisement rates in 1930 in Arizona, about 0.5 to 1.9% of all Arizonans were disenfranchised because they had a felony conviction. Now it's approaching 10%. And actually, if you are African American, as you can imagine, just like everything else in the criminal justice system, it affects you and damages you permanently far more than it does if you're Caucasian. More than 20% of African Americans in Arizona are disenfranchised because of a felony conviction. I like this. I like these cartograms because they obviously show, it's that old adage, if anybody did theater, what your theater teacher always taught you was show, don't tell. This does a great job of showing you the problem. It is the size of each state by the disenfranchised population. This is how big Arizona would be compared to California, New York, Illinois, another place that we like to demonize and be afraid of in the media. Guess what's the biggest? Arizona, Texas, the South, Florida. In Arizona in 2016, I need to update these numbers for 2018, but I apologize, I've still got my 2016 numbers. There was about 221,000 people who were disenfranchised, 221,000. This is a little chart of different states' felony disenfranchisement restrictions. In Arizona, you'll see that you cannot vote if you're in prison, on parole, on probation, or up to 2 years after you're released from prison. That's how far we go. And if it's your second, third, fourth, or fifth felony conviction, you do not get your rights restored automatically. You have to jump through hoops, pay fines and fees, and sometimes find a lawyer to help you get your right to vote back. This is a big reason why Arizona is red. So in 2016, Arizona had 221,000 voters who were disenfranchised because they could not vote. That is 4.2% of the population. Trump won by 3.5%. He won by a smaller percentage than the voters we have that are disenfranchised. In Florida, he won by 1.2% of the population. 10% of the population is disenfranchised. Felony voter disenfranchisement, voter suppression is a big reason why states are red. She won by the highest total of any Democrat. She won by more than 12,000 votes. That is only 5% of the disenfranchised voters. If we didn't have felony disenfranchisement, she would have won by 10, 15, 20% of the vote. Let's look at the LD where we got defeated the worst, which is LD 22, Senator Burgess, a Republican. In 2016, Senator Burgess won by 33,000 votes. It was the biggest margin of any Republican state victory in 2016. That's only 15% of disenfranchised voters in Arizona. If those 221,000 people were not disenfranchised, even the reddest of red districts in Arizona, we could have the chance of flipping. Felony disenfranchisement is one of the most effective methods of voter suppression in this state and around the country. When I look at the history of mass incarceration, what I see is a history of banality of evil. There are many people, many academics who will disagree with me. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, is a fantastic read. I encourage everyone to read it like 3 times if you have it. There are academics and there's theoreticians who look at the American criminal justice system and they see intentional evil. They see a system that was built for the express purpose of incarcerating hundreds of thousands of minorities, that was built for the express purpose of torturing people, that was built for the express purpose of denying people their most basic civil and political rights. I don't see that. What I see, which actually is, in a way that I'm going to talk to you about, kind of worse, is that we do these things through banal evil. It's not just a lapse in judgment, it's that we are thoughtless. Going back to that statistic about juveniles who are sexually assaulted in prison, 1 out of 8, that's not intentional. That is the result of thoughtlessness, because we don't think about what appropriating money for jails and prisons and cops will do to kids who then have to interact with jails and prisons and cops. Nobody, including Republicans, voted to have 1 in 8 juveniles sexually assaulted in prison. But we don't think about it. And so therefore we get the system of thoughtlessness, the system of commonplace and trite evil. Now, this is not new in the American system. You know, we have a healthcare system where 45,000 people in the United States die every year from substandard healthcare. That is an example of banality of evil. I don't think anybody is voting to kill 45,000 Americans every year because they want to defund Obamacare. They're making a political decision that results through thoughtlessness in those deaths. We see this in our foreign policy. We invade Iraq, which then leads to Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, which then leads to ISIL, or Daesh, or ISIS, however you want to phrase it. We see this thoughtlessness, this banality, this triteness, not just in criminal justice, not just in healthcare, not just in foreign policy. We see it in environmental policy. This is actually a mural taken from the side of a building in Chernobyl. And we see the devastating environmental effects of nuclear policy, of energy policy, of forgetting about the environment. This crowd, see, this is the crowd for this. I know. Other crowds, I just get blank stares. Like, Kat right now has no idea who this is. She's like 25, so you'll have to forgive her. We construct these systems of deterrence, these systems of protection and defense, because we think we're trying to make the world a better place. And yet, one little switch goes dead, one thing goes wrong, and all of a sudden, we've killed tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people through our own thoughtlessness, because we did not spend the time thinking about what kind of system we are building. And that is exactly what we've done with prisons and jails in this country for the last 30, 40 years. We haven't thought about it. I still insist we don't think about it as much as we should. The ability that we have as defense attorneys, as prosecutors, as judges, and police officers in this system. Because one thing I hear all too frequently when I talk about these things with my colleagues is that, well, it's the law. Mandatory minimum sentencing is the law. Sending juveniles to prison for stealing a 6-pack of beer from Circle K is the law. Sending women to jail for possessing a sugar packet of heroin is the law, which is true. But that is not the end of the argument. That is the beginning of the argument. And people in my position, especially judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys, we don't get to do Pontius Pilate because the law is the law. We actually bear a special responsibility precisely because the law is the law. Now, what I'm about to tell you is, the disclaimer I want to use is that what I'm talking about in these next few minutes is a metaphor. I'm going to be talking about the body of law that developed after World War II as a result of the Holocaust. What I am not saying, and what I've never said, is that the American criminal justice system is the same thing as the Holocaust. I do not believe that. And anybody who tells you that, quite frankly, is out of their minds. The reason I'm bringing this to your attention is because after World War II, a body of law emerged which set out how we hold systems and governments and actors accountable for implementing policies that intentionally or unintentionally lead to harm and death. That's what's important. That's the importance of the metaphor. I haven't given this disclaimer properly before and people have been offended, so I just want to be clear about why I'm bringing this up. So, in 1962, Israeli Mossad agents went to Buenos Aires and they kidnapped Lieutenant Colonel Adolf Eichmann of the SS. They brought him back to stand trial in Jerusalem for crimes against the Jewish people, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. He was found guilty, he was executed, the judgment was affirmed by the Israeli Supreme Court, and in a colorful detail that I like, even though I'm adamantly opposed to the death penalty, but I still like this detail, his ashes were taken by an Israeli Navy ship and spread outside of Israeli territorial waters, which I thought was an interesting detail. Eichmann was the guy who made the trains run on time. And I mean that literally. And I don't mean literally in the way my generation says literally when they mean figuratively, which pisses me off to no end. I can't stand it. I actually mean literally. That was his job. He sat in an office in Vienna. He never went to a concentration camp or an extermination camp. There was no evidence of that in his trial. He never pulled a gas switch or shot somebody or hung somebody. His job was to sit in an office in Vienna and to fix train tables so that the proper number of trains would pick up the proper number of Jews in the right city and take them to the proper extermination camp, and those trains wouldn't interfere with other trains transporting soldiers to and from the Eastern Front. He made the trains run on time. And Hannah Arendt attended his trial. She attended his trial that began April 11th, 1961. She is probably one of my greatest heroes of my life. Political philosopher, born in Germany, fled to the United States during the war. And in explaining her trial, her interpretation of the trial, she sat there for months and months and months and listened to Eichmann's testimony. And what struck Hannah Arendt about Adolf Eichmann was that he did not appear to have any motives. There was no track record she could find in his life of him being an ardent anti-Semite. And like I said, he wasn't a killer in the traditional sense of the word. He didn't kill people with his own hand. He didn't even order deaths. But what she saw in him was a man who had no motives, who was given orders by his superior officers to make the trains run on time. And he did that because he wanted to get promoted. And he never realized what he was doing. He just never thought about it. He never thought about Jews as humans, just like we don't think about kids in the criminal justice system as human. Because if we did, we would not go to bed tonight tolerating 1 in 8 of them being sexually assaulted. He didn't think about them the same way as he thought about Germans. And it's not that he didn't know what he was doing. That's very different. It's not a claim that, well, he thought he was making the trains run on time because they were carrying potatoes and milk. He knew exactly who was on that train, and he knew what was going to happen to them when they got off the train. He just didn't understand the moral implications of them. It just never set in when she watched him, when she observed him, and when he testified. And she found a unique challenge in Adolf Eichmann because one of the hallmarks of the American criminal justice system, which we took from the British criminal justice system, is that you have to have actus reus and mens rea. You have to have an act, but you also have intent. It's not enough that you perform an evil deed. You have to intend to do harm in order to be held criminally liable. And in Eichmann, Hannah Arendt found a very, very challenging person, because while she was perfectly convinced that he did harm, and she was perfectly convinced that on a shallow level he intended to exterminate Jews and gypsies and gays, he just somehow didn't intend for it to be as horrific as it turned out to be. He didn't think about it enough. Eichmann's defense, and this is really what gets the nub of why I'm bringing this up to you today. Defense attorneys, I include myself in this, and defense attorneys are uniquely responsible for these crimes. Eichmann's defense is that I was just following orders, that it was the law, because it was the law, because Adolf Hitler was democratically elected in 1933, and the Reichstag, one of their last official acts as a democratically elected legislature, was to grant him plenipotentiary power to carry out what became known as the Holocaust. All of these were actions that were traced directly back to not only a democracy, but in 1930s, one of the most advanced industrial democracies in the world. And the Israeli Supreme Court roundly rejected this defense. They said, you don't get to claim immunity from immoral acts because of superior orders. You don't get to be an ostrich and bury your head in the sand. And in fact, the degree of responsibility for these crimes actually increases the further away you get from the man or woman who pulls the switch or pulls the trigger or turns on the gas. The people who give the orders, the people who make the trains run, they're actually more responsible than the people who carry the orders out. And in the context of our criminal justice system, what I argue is people like me and prosecutors and police officers who are making the trains run on this system, who keep cycling people into this system, we, not them, I'm including myself, we bear more and more responsibility for the crimes of this system than individual police officers and prison guards. I firmly believe that. I am very much part of this problem. This is just a picture of the defendants in the main Nuremberg tribunal. And from this came Nuremberg Principle 4, the fact that a person acted pursuant to orders of their government or a superior does not relieve them of responsibility under international law, provided moral choice was possible. They said, the Nuremberg Tribunal said to these Nazis, just because you had orders, you are not relieved from responsibility because you're still human and you still have an individual moral compass. And you did not act on that moral compass, and that's why you're guilty. I know, I told you it's real depressing. I hate reading slides, but I like this one a lot, so I'm going to read it to you. What is most frightening is that this monstrous deed, this deliberate attempt to destroy and transform the human condition, does not require monstrous or evil motives. It can result from thoughtlessness, the inability to think of ordinary, normal people. So let's rewrite this. What is most frightening is that mass incarceration, this attempt to destroy and transform the lives of women who've been abused, of poor people of color, and people who are mentally ill, does not require monstrous or evil motives. It can result from thoughtlessness, the inability of ordinary, normal people, i.e. us, to think about what we're doing. That's the criminal justice system. The metaphor to the Holocaust is not a metaphor of kind. It is a metaphor of moral principle. Anybody speak German? It sounds better in German. Anybody? Altschnur. What is it? Nice. Everydayness. The banality of evil is everydayness. Because it happens all day, every day. And these are the people who do it. The people who committed the Holocaust were not vampires with blood dripping from their fangs. This is a picture of Auschwitz guards taken while they were on a weekend picnic. Because they look like us. The same people who voted for mass incarceration. The same people who allow this to continue in our names. The same people who keep the same prosecutors in office year after year after year, to the point where we have the fourth highest incarceration rate in the world, to the point where we have 157% more women in jail than we did in 1996. This is us. And we have this choice. As Hannah Arendt wrote, individual human beings at their most basic level are capable of telling right from wrong. All they have is their own moral compass to guide them. There is no expectation, even if you're religious, there is no expectation that you will hear a voice from above telling you what to do. It is your own choice, or lack thereof. You are making a choice at a very basic level. I am making it a choice at a very basic level to allow this to continue. We like to think that the American criminal justice system is fair, that it's balanced, that it's about due process. But as I've probably shown you in some horrible 20 minutes of PTSD-inducing slides, it's not. And some people have seen this. Her name is former federal judge Nancy Gertner, and she wrote this in a 2016 editorial to the Boston Globe. On a 17-year judicial career, I sent hundreds of defendants to jail. 80% of them received a sentence that was disproportionate, unfair, or discriminatory. Do you see what she's saying here? She's saying that over her entire career, 80% of the people that she sent to jail, she should not have sent to jail either for that long or for that crime. 80%. Mass incarceration was not an abstraction. Sadly, I was part of it. I protested, but now I left the bench to undo the damage that I and others have done. This was not a police officer. This was a federal judge of 17 years' experience. So when I said that prosecutors and judges and defense attorneys are part of the problem, it's because we keep these gears running. Because all of us, public defenders included, we understand what's going on, and yet we still go to work and we still do our part to make sure that this system doesn't collapse. And I've struggled with that. In the last 3 years since I've been head of my office, I've struggled with that greatly. Because on the one hand, the letters that George wrote to you, I've gotten letters from my clients, individual clients, who thank me for saving their lives and thank me for doing good. And every public defender has gotten those letters. I'm not unique, I'm not special in any way. We all get those letters. And so you have that experience of knowing that you're going to court every day and you're fighting as hard as you can for poor people and marginalized people and mentally ill people. And you're getting some amazing results for your clients. And at the same time, if it wasn't for you pleading out 97% of your clients, if it wasn't for you through silence and inaction, acquiescing to this system, the system would not function. And for me, it has become a very, very real moral problem in my work. And for a lot of people, actually, in my work, we talk about this constantly. We are both part of the solution and part of the problem. Because we make sure the trains run on time. We go to court. I've been to court millions of times, and I've had clients who've gotten horrible sentences. Clients who've gone to prison for crimes they didn't commit. Clients who are getting punished because they're poor, because they have a different skin color than me. I've not chained myself to the judge. I've not, tried to physically prevent them from being taken out of the courthouse. I've said what I was supposed to say. I've been an officer of the court, and when the judge passes that horrible, unjust sentence, I walk out and I go and work on my next case. That, in and of itself, is part of the problem. So what's the good news?